Teodor to ask questions and, moderate the discussion. I'd like to briefly introduce the guests tonight. Drofenik grew up in Malta and now lives in Victoria, Australia. She was awarded the National Book Prize in 2017 for prose for her novel The Confectioner's Daughter, published by Horizons. Her fiction is founded on extensive historical research, and it focuses mainly on the migrant experience, and specifically in the Maltese-Australian context. Here's Lou. Nikola Petković, second last, is a writer, literary critic, translator, screenwriter, and scholar. He earned his PhD in comparative literature at the University of Texas, and his fields of expertise include ethnic, national, racial, and class identities, cultures of Central Europe, and intercultural communication. Vera Duarte debuted as an author with the publication of the poems Amania Madrugada, I hope I pronounced it okay, 1993. This was followed by numerous publications of poetry, novels, essays, and chronicles. She has presided and participated in national, international conferences, mainly on the subject, on subjects related to human rights, women, culture, and literature. Last but not least, Ò Ceallaigh has published, is Irish, and has published over 40 stories, many of which collected in notes from a Turkish whorehouse, for which he was awarded the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature. He is also an essayist and translator, and among other books, he has translated Mikhail Sebastian's For 2000 Years, published by Penguin Classics. And he now lives in Bucharest. And has traveled the world extensively and speaks 6 languages. That's what I've been reading about. Anyway, I leave. You will be correcting maybe what I've said a bit later. Teodor, because you're a bit uncertain. So, Teodor, I leave you with it, and please enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona.
I hope that he will speak words because I didn't.
Hello? Okay, it's on. Thank you, Simona, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here for this conference. As I said in an email, because these things are a bit planned. I know we're trying to give the impression that this will all be improvised, but these things are slightly planned before. I have been enjoying your work over the past few months after I've been drafted to deliver this conference, and I've been struck by the sheer variety of the works put together, which will give, I hope, an interesting edge to this conference. Now, the title is Literature and Diaspora, so I think we need to start from there, I would say, and with the very concept of diaspora. Now, the idea of diaspora seems to be simple enough to grasp, lexically at least, from a superficial point of view. It is people who were born somewhere and now live elsewhere. But my first question to all of you, and we can do this in whichever order, is what does the diaspora mean to you as a literary concept, as a literary exercise, as part of literary practice? Maybe Philip could start?
Oh, I'm the wrong person to start with. Because I think you've begun this idea with thinking about writers who live away from their own country, but write about their own country. And it doesn't apply to me because I don't write about Ireland at all. Almost not at all. Most of what I've written tends to be about my adopted country. Which is Romania, where I've lived the last 20 years. So I think more of it is just something that gives me a different perspective on things. I've no... the other thing is I've no conscious idea as a writer of who's reading my books. And that might be because at a certain point thought I'd never be published, or very little read anyway, and it was mostly an activity that I was doing for myself. And subsequent to that, I have readers, and I can look at the way the writing is responded to differently by people from different places, but that's kind of after the fact. What I find very interesting is the way the same work is read completely differently by somebody in Romania from someone in Ireland, you know? The Romanians tend to read it as something quite factual and realistic, whereas, you know, a critic in Ireland will think, I've got a crazy imagination and how could I invent such things? The same stories, you know.
And when you say that the Romanians think it's something factual and realistic, is there maybe an element of, you know, you sometimes need an outsider's perspective to really present something in as unbiased, perhaps, a fashion, or something that isn't infected by local hang-ups, shall we say? Do you think there's an element of that?
There can be a great advantage in distance, and it's not only a matter of distance from country. I mean, distance in sense of detachment from anything you're writing about is an asset. You know, it's you know, it's in some ways easier to write about being 20 when you're 50 than when you're 20, when you're in the middle of it all. This is valid for nearly anything, and the country I live in is quite a challenge to describe. I'd say more the city I live in. I live in a city, that it is quite an extreme place. Another enormous subject, I don't know if I should get into it now, is the legacy of censorship, which was particularly strong in Romania, and affected the way people wrote about things around them. So I really didn't have a lot of the kind of self-consciousness that a lot of Romanian writers would have had about 10 years after the revolution in describing the things around me. And I'm not even talking about the freedom to say things. I'm talking about a certain stylistic approach to writing about things, a certain directness which wasn't there. In all the countries in Eastern Europe, there was censorship, different kinds. There was also samizdat publishing. There was people were publishing underground, you know. Romania, I think, was the only communist country where there was not, simply because of the scale of the repression. It was just too dangerous. So a writer had a choice. You either didn't publish at all, or you went through the censor. So if you're going through the censor, you had to suffer a kind of stylistic deformation. You had to encode everything. You had to make it extremely complicated, you know? And that became the habit. So that even when they didn't have to do it anymore, there were a few years before people could learn just to let go and say things directly. So I noticed that greatly when I came to Romania first, that this was, it was evident in film, it was evident in writing, and it's taken some time to change.
Yeah, one thinks of something like Master and Margarita. You know, obviously it's a great work in and of itself, but a lot of the allegory that's unfolded in that could be seen to come from avoiding censorship or a desire from.
And the Russian experience is extraordinary in this relationship to censorship too, because Russian writing in the 1920s, it wasn't clear then, you know, what was the degree of freedom. So you have writers like Isaac Babel and Bulgakov and Platonov coming out, you know, quite modernist writers who were very experimental, and then that all closed down at the end of the 1920s. So it's an enormous subject, you know, how writers responded to censorship in these different countries.
Yeah. And Lou, you obviously have a very direct experience for us here, certainly for the Maltese, but could you tell us what the diaspora means to you and what being, because your writing is so directly connected to that experience too in some ways.
Well, yes. Well, first of all, okay. First of all, I don't like labels on literature. I don't like people calling diasporic writing or migrant writing or ethnic writing or minority writing, because in Australia, especially once you put a label, you diminish the work and your readership is diminished very greatly. So I think writing per se, I prefer to say writing from people who have left the country, or, you know. For me, writing of migration writing always has the migration experience, you know, the experience of longing for your country, the grief of parting, the landscape, which is very different, you know, finding yourself in a different community, trying to fit in that society. That's what diasporic writing to me means to me. Australia has a vast literature from migration, because, you know, Australia is blessed with people from all over the world. We've got writers at the moment. We've got writers from Iran, from Iraq, from Somalia, from Afghanistan, and they all bring together their voices. So to me, the diasporic literature is the literature of your experience, isn't it? It's the voices of the people who've come from other countries.
Yes, yes. But clearly, looking at your bibliography, there is a clear drive towards writing about Malta, not just in the Confectioner's Daughter, but in your other works, and there is obviously the more evident and more obvious side to it, which is an element of autobiography or family history that you're interested in. But I'm pretty sure that there is also other motivations that drive you to return to Malta. What keeps you coming back, really?
I think I love Maltese culture, and I love Maltese stories. You know, I grew up in a family of storytellers. My unmarried aunts used to tell me a lot of stories, and my head is full of their stories. I always told stories. I told stories to my children as they were growing up, stories to my students when I was teaching, and now I write stories because they are too long to tell. And I love the Maltese voice, the Maltese character is always in my head. You know, Maltese women. I listen to a lot of migrant women speaking too, and I know their experiences. I've interviewed many women who've come to Australia, and they are such amazing women. You know, they have such wonderful stories that it's a never-ending. I have enough to write another 100 novels, I think.
Yes. And the novel is a very accommodating genre,
yes,
so
it's a good genre,
yes, you
yes.
found an
Yes.
adequate outlet
Yes.
for that. Nikola, your own experience of the diaspora, and how do you perceive it through your own work, if it factors in, really?
Well, I really don't feel like a diasporic writer. I mean, diaspora, now, I do feel like in a dentist's office with this light in front of me, so I'm a little bit displaced if this is the diasporic experience. Diaspora means spreading or scattering people and groups by expelling them from their native countries. What I experienced when I was leaving Yugoslavia in the 90s, at the beginning of a war, and the vanishing of the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia, it was more like a self-imposed exile. And I remember a conference in Chicago. I went first for New York, and then to Austin, where I did my PhD in comparative literature. And I remember a very interesting title of a conference in Chicago, "No One Will Kick Me Out, I Will Leave." So I can more talk about the experience, again, of a self-imposed exile. But it's also interesting, you know, how do you define it? For instance, there is, or there was at least, a beautiful periodical in Toronto, in Canada, called Exile. And the motto of Exile was by Julio Cortázar, who himself lived in exile. And he said, only a writer who lives in his own country can experience a true dimension of exile. So I don't know, I'm afraid that while talking about exile, I might be departing from diasporic issues, and I don't know if it is whether welcome to our discussion. And if you
It is.
If you were just to allow me, I want to comment on two things that my colleagues said about the experience of Romania, right? There was some kind of, I had some troubles hearing, but if I understood well, you said they did not have either samizdat or tamizdat because it was way too dangerous under Ceausescu, right? What was interesting in Yugoslavia is, and I think only Dubravka Ugrešić, a writer who left Yugoslavia for Amsterdam, really pointed out the interesting thing in former Yugoslavia, or in Yugoslavia, where we had 6 republics, was we did not have a single dissident writer. Why? Because, excuse my language, if you screwed up in Croatia, you could publish in Serbia. And it's still the same country. And it was my own experience. Also, speaking of identitarian issues, it was very difficult to declare yourself as, yes, by nationality, I'm Croatian. But I lived in the state of Yugoslavia, which actually never worked as a state. The only entity that functioned was the federal army. Even the constitution was not respected in each and every republic. Like if you told a joke in Slovenia that was highly politically charged, they would tell you, please don't do it anymore. If you told a joke in Bosnia, you would end up in prison for 8 months, for 10 months. So, and also, you mentioned something about the tradition or the factual, realistic reading you experience once you became displaced. I mean, you moved to a different culture, to a different country, and the same thing I experienced when I came to the United States, and I tried to teach Good Soldier Švejk by Jaroslav Hašek. It was absolutely impossible. Then I figured out it was the first time, the first culture, the US culture, when somebody tells a joke and then they have to add, I'm just kidding. In my country, if you don't get a joke, you don't survive. Like in Czech Republic, the same. So the concept of Švejkian passive resistance was absolutely lost in cultural translation. And I will end up with this. I think English has a beautiful way to put it, and I cannot help myself thinking of Ulysses and the Odyssey and his journey back home to Ithaca. He was always in between longing and belonging. longing for something and belonging to a place. So while being all together elsewhere, he wanted to feel at home in the world, but he still wanted to come back to Ithaca, to Penelope, to Telemachus, which might bring us to one of the following questions probably you will ask, the questions of nostalgia. I'm sorry if I took too much time.
No, not to worry. We have time. Vera, as we spoke earlier, the interesting thing here is that you yourself are not a diasporic writer, so to speak, but of course the Capo Verdean experience is a very diasporic one in many ways. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
About
Yes,
Cape Verde,
yes,
and diasporization. So, good evening. I apologize for my poor English, but I'm not an English speaker, so I came and I took some notes because I would like people to understand what I'm going to say. But I'm going to speak about the Cape Verde experience of diaspora, because Cape Verde results from a diasporization of deportees and enslaved, because the island, I speak about the island of Cape Verde, there are 10 islands, discovered, deserted in 1460 by navigator in the service of King Dom Afonso of Portugal. Given their excellent location in the Middle Atlantic, quickly began to be populated by Europeans, Portuguese, Genovese, Spanish, most of them in the condition of deported, and by Africans brought from the west coast of Africa in the inhuman condition of enslaved. So the Cape Verde himself results from a diasporization from other people. They came to Cape Verde, who was deserted. And some few years after Cape Verde began to be populated, people begin to diasporization himself, because in Cape Verde the ecosystem was very difficult, and the lack of rain made that a lot of times we have drought and famine. And so the people from Cape Verde have to diasporization, to go to diaspora, to have to gain their life. The diasporization of Cape Verdean people are not only because of economic reasons, but also sociological, political, professional. And what happened is that in Cape Verde we have 10 islands, but one more island who is the island of the diasporization people, because we have Cape Verdean people in all continents, in Portugal, in France, in America, in everywhere. So a little different from other countries. In Cape Verde, the writers from the diaspora are considered at the same place as the writers who live in the islands. But of course, what is, I can say, rather different is what they write about. But if I'm going to synthesize, I can say that almost all Cape Verdean writers in the diaspora wrote about Cape Verde. They criticizing or praising, speaking of infinite longing, love, hate, distance and death, of exile and exiles, of the family, the people, from drought and rain, from the contagious joy of the people of the island, a poetry of exile and a prose of collective ethnic memory. Of course, you have also some writers, Cape Verdean writers in the diaspora, who have another kind of register. I can say the case of a very known poet from Cape Verde who lived and died in Portugal, Daniel Felipe, who wrote an anthological poem whose title was The Invention of Love, who is really a tremendous poem, although he is Cape Verdean, but the thematic is absolutely universal, but there are few writers who have this kind of register. I will say that most of Cape Verdean writers in the diaspora wrote about Cape Verde and about the problems they have. I can quote Luis Romano, for instance, who wrote a very, very impressive romance novel whose name is Famintos, who speaks about the famine, the famine, and he wrote in go everywhere, Brazil, United States, France. So what I can say is that the literature of the diaspora in Cape Verde is very, it's close. When we create, and if you allow me, I can say something. 4 years ago, because Cape Verde is independent only 40 years ago. 4 years ago, we create the Academy of Writers of Cape Verde, who was the first Academy of Writers in all the African countries Portuguese speaking. And when we create the Academy of Writers, half of the immortals of the Academy was Cape Verdean writers who live in the diaspora, and half live in the interior of the country. And half of the academician lives out, and half lives in the country. I don't know.
Yes, yeah, I mean, there are certainly lots of connections to be made, both in terms of islands and in terms of
slowly.
Yes, yes, sorry.
Slowly.
There are certainly a lot of connections that I can think of, even with Malta, in terms of a big part of writers operating right now who are based in places like Brussels because of professional employment opportunities and so on, and the idea of writers living in the diaspora, like Lou herself, for example.
Allow me to say something who I find interesting also. You say that there are some similitudes between the writers in Cape Verde and the writers in Malta. This is not strange for me, because when I arrived here, I noticed that Malta have 500,000 people and Cape Verde have 500,000 people. The difference is that our 500,000 people is in 10 islands, and here there are in just one space. But also, as Malta, we have more than 1 million living in the United States, in Portugal, in France, in Senegal. So that's why you can find a lot of Cape Verdean writers living really in the diaspora.
Another thing you mentioned, and I'd like to also pass it on to the others, was the idea of longing. And Nikola also mentioned nostalgia as a perennial theme, as an inevitable theme, perhaps, for writers in the diaspora or diasporic writers. I was wondering if I do want to get your perspective on this, Philip, because precisely because you might not be the obvious candidate to start with, but as someone who writes about the country that they are living in and not your own country, and as somebody who, as you mentioned, did engage with obviously with the political realities of that country. You mentioned censorship, you mentioned other forms of suppression. I'm wondering if either through the research you did or to the people you've met who have informed your stories, whether a sense of nostalgia for a past that might not have been ideal, but that does communicate something about the identity of the country, whether it was relevant to you. Because even when you said that you look at we mentioned the thing about the outsider's eye looking in. Was there something about the recent history of the city that you live in that informed your writing and informed the general tone of what you wrote?
No, not immediately. Again, it was never something that was deeply reflected or analyzed. I never worked like that. I moved to Romania simply for very practical, personal reasons, that I wanted to write, and I just wasn't able to afford to live in a normal country, if I can put it that way. And as I began to write, I just found that there was enough to write about in the things around me. But it didn't seem to come through any filter. It wasn't a very reflective act. That's come later, but I'm talking about at the beginning when I began to write the fiction. The non-fiction's another matter. I found that the environment was sufficiently aggressive, extreme, stimulating, desperate, that it wasn't a case of having to find things to write about. It was more a case of just trying to sort it as it came at me, you know, and try and make some sense of my environment. In that sense, it was nearly like almost a physical act, more than an intellectual one. Okay, intellectual maybe, but at a more basic emotional level. As time goes by and you become a little more self-conscious of what you write and what happens when you write, you begin to notice other things and do different things than you do at the very beginning with writing. And now I do notice that my relationship to the place is, I use it. Because I don't think as a writer of fiction you're dealing with firstly a factual reality. You're dealing with the things that actually concern you as a human being most of all, and you're trying to figure out what this has in common with all the other human beings around you. And I don't mean this even in the other human beings in the country you live. I mean human beings everywhere. And I see that I'm, at this point in my stories, I think I use the city I live in almost as an abstract space that gives me enough freedom. I don't think I could do that with Ireland. I don't think I could do that with Ireland. You'd immediately be caught up in the idiom, the way people speak, and very specific things. I feel kind of drawn back enough from Bucharest that I'm free to do my own thing with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but would you say it is simply, I mean, I'm asking you to imagine another possibility, but would you say that would you imagine that you would have the same mental space in if you had to move in another country that isn't Bucharest, another city that isn't Bucharest?
I really don't know that. I don't know that. I know I have written about other countries as well. You know, I've written about quite a few different countries. Yes. I've set stories in different places. But again, I see the same thing happening. Is you're actually using a place, an environment, a situation to allow you to compose something that talks about what's going on deeper in you, about your deeper preoccupations. And in that, it's simply it's an opportunistic act. You know, you're always looking for a way to put things so that they can be somehow in the exterior, nearly like an objective reality.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that you have tried to write about Ireland before, maybe, and that you didn't find it as fertile, or do you remember writing about Ireland? Could you tell us about that experience?
I've written one or two stories about Ireland. Again, I haven't lived there for the past 20 years. It doesn't interest me, especially. Yeah. You know? Okay. One of the things I like about the environment in Bucharest is the way everything is possibly because it's a city that suffered a lot and a country that suffered a lot. It's quite raw. Everything seems to be coming up to the surface. You know, there's no pretty surface on things. I like that aspect of it. It's nearly the deeper ugliness is actually just coming out of the bricks and things. And as a physical environment, that gives me a certain pleasure to, because I like filth. Yes, I like to wallow in it.
Yeah, I can imagine that to be a very fertile environment for writers, certainly. Yeah. Lou, however, I'm going to assume that the nostalgia question is going to be a bit more direct in your case, given your work. Could you speak a bit about how nostalgia? Because nostalgia can, of course, be very dangerous and it can lead to obscurity rather than enlightenment sometimes. So I was wondering, how do you engage with it in your work? How do you meet it halfway?
Well, I think. Put this ahead. Well, I think every writer who is removed from his or her country, their first writings are full of nostalgia. You can't help it because your country pulls at you, doesn't it? And you have feelings of loneliness. Like for me to go to Australia, I was 21 when I went to Australia. I was very excited to be there. You know, it was a great adventure for a 21-year-old girl to go by herself to this new country with 10 pounds in my purse and just what I was wearing in a little suitcase. And when I got there, it was a beautiful place. It was very exciting. The music and whatever. But then when you settle down and you try to embed yourself in the culture, you start to long for that place which you call home. And Malta kept pulling at my heartstrings and calling me, you know. And in my dreams, I always was walking the streets of Malta and going to the beaches. And I'll get up in August on a cold, freezing day, and I think, oh, I'm going to the beach today. And then I say, no, it's winter, you know. And you think, oh, I shouldn't be here. And then I think as a writer, you do put that nostalgia in your beginning writings because you're writing from your heart too, and your character is based in that country. But then as you grow older, I suppose, you start removing yourself from that because you realize that nostalgia is memory, isn't it? And it's a place. And it's a place you can't go to. You can't return to it. And I think in my books, I can see now that in my books, the beginning, my first book had nostalgia in it. But as I move away and as the years pass, I'm more removed from this place. And I can see it more clearly.
And what is it that makes you feel removed from Malta?
What makes me removed from Malta?
Yeah.
coming back and seeing what goes on. Yes, I think it took the polish, you know, nostalgia, I think, puts a polish on people, doesn't it? It puts a polish on the place. So you see the place, you don't see, in the beginning, I didn't see Malta as it is. I saw it with this big halo, you know, and I want to come here. I want to live in this place. And I had a lot of ambivalence about leaving. Did I do the right thing? Should I be there? Is it better here? Why am I here? It's so hard to be here. I have, you know, a new life. I have to think in a new language. I have to do all sorts of different things. But as time goes by, you know that you can't go back. Because I think nostalgia is not just about the place. Nostalgia is the place of your youth, isn't it, when you were young?
Yes.
You know, you want to go back to that memory time, and you realize that it is a place you can't return to. And that's how you get rid of it, I suppose, in your writing.
Yeah.
And you start seeing the place as it is. And I think by coming back, you realize, well, you know, now I have roots in another place. I'll put my 2 feet together in that place rather than keep 1 foot on one side of the earth and the other one on the other side.
Yes.
And I think it comes with your writing. The characters are more developed and they are more away from Malta.
Yeah. So, because obviously there is, we can say that there is a distinction between experiencing nostalgia for your native country as a person, but then as a writer, you mentioned just now the characters and how they evolve.
Yes.
How does that come across in the actual writing, the words on the page? What does that change?
How does it change? That's a very hard question, isn't it? I think they're more removed from the country. They see the country with different eyes. You know, now, a character will see the country through my eyes. I have Australian eyes now. You know, I have a Maltese heart, but I have Australian eyes. So I'm critical when I come here. And my characters are the same. You know, they have acquired Australian eyes, although they have a Maltese heart.
Yeah, it's a very interesting biological metaphor there. Nikola, you are the one to bring up nostalgia with great concern. I was wondering what you were preparing, what you had under your sleeve, as we say in Malta.
Please.
Actually, I kept keeping notes while other people were talking. Nostalgia, first of all, I want to tell you a story about, it's a short, very short, about a Cuban writer in exile, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, whose parents were the founding father and founding mother of the Cuban Communist Party. And they were destroyed by Castro's regime, and he moved to Europe, Cabrera Infante, and they asked him, so why did you desert, why did you abandon, why did you betray Cuba? And he said, well, let me tell you a story. When Titanic was sinking, there was one of the officers on the ship who left and abandoned the ship. And according to the laws, he was supposed to die with the ship. And he answered, no, my lord, I have not abandoned the ship. The ship has betrayed me. I was told it's unsinkable. So every totalitarian regime, such as Cuban and Yugoslavian communist regime, tend to tell us they are eternal. In some paradoxical way, they are forged in time, in history, and then they manage to eject themselves on a symbolical level and contextual level outside of time, outside of history. We're here forever. Then the 90s happened, and then Yugoslavia perished. So it was my first exile while I was still at home. Croatia became a new country. We had great hopes. that, after the fall of Berlin Wall, we'll have democracy. What did we get? We got Berlin Mall instead of Berlin Wall. We are all in transition for almost 30 years. In the 90s, what they did to us, who still were there, we were not really encouraged to remember what happened 2 weeks ago in Yugoslavia because it was prescribed. But we were very much encouraged to remember what happened 1,000 years ago when our first king was crowned. So I asked myself, okay, if a country is in a millennial hibernation, I mean, how can you awake from such a long state of coma and be normal? What have been we doing for 1,000 years? So this was basically my first displacement and my first sense of nostalgia. The one that happened in the United States was very much, it was different. I came there as a student, and my English was so terrible. And I haven't been using it for years now, so I am aware it's, again, pretty rusty, and I apologize. And I was a teaching assistant, and the chair of my department sent me to teach. After a semester of grading papers, I was sent to teach. And he told me openly, Nikola, you are on the 2nd floor. Your English sucks. Your classroom is on the 4th floor. Please don't take an elevator, go on foot. You have 2 floors to fix the language and start teaching. For the first 2 years, when I was in the United States, I was mute. I was embarrassed to talk. And language was everything I had. I was not a painter, I was not an architect, I was not a dancer, I was not a musician. And probably most of you know that Martin Heidegger said that the language is a house of being. The term is Sein in German. So I don't know, if you are for 2 years silent, what's happening to yourself? What's happening to your being? Because I was 28 years old biologically, but linguistically I was 9. It was a big gap, very frustrating. Then I started to write poetry because I remembered that Roman Jakobson, a Russian theoretician of literature, said that one of the very important things for writing verses is aphasia. So you can really write things that don't make much sense, and wow, it sounds good. So you start with poetry in foreign language. And it's also some paradoxical sense of freedom that you are using a language that you really didn't master, and you kind of step outside yourself and start writing in that language. All the way, the underpinning of it was nostalgia, because for years, I was thinking in Croatian and then translating into English whatever I was doing. When I first time started dreaming in English, I said, okay, now I know the language. Now I'm fine. Of course, I had to write my PhD in English, but that's easy. It's theory. It's like doing math with words. And then I wrote a longer poem in English. And the last experience I had upon my return to Croatia, because nostalgia, I had this very different experience from some other colleagues and friends who were from the former Yugoslavia studying at the University of Texas at Austin. The more I was there, the nostalgia was bigger. And at one point, my mother simply had to put me in the bus, like I was 9 years old, to make sure I'm going back to the States and I'm going back to work. And one summer, I simply stayed in Croatia. I just relocated myself once again. And upon the return, I wrote a novel, and I'm not going to end now. I wrote a novel, How to Tie Your Shoes, in Croatian. It got published in Croatian. And then I did self-translation in English that came out with Dalkai Archive Press, and we are going to talk about this, I think, tomorrow. And this was an incredible experience because I was writing a different book. It was not, see, for the first time, I experienced this concept of a translation as a cultural adaptation. I was addressing American audience. In my English, I would never say it's an English translation of my novel. No, it's an English version of my novel.
Thank you for that, Nikola. Vera, I don't know if you want to, because you mentioned that Cabo Verdean writers in the diaspora, especially, obviously because there's so many, they write on many different subjects. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate through some of these writers on this subject of nostalgia and what are they nostalgic for exactly? What are the connections that they strive to have with the home country?
Yes. Although I live in the interior of the country, I must say that also me and others like me, we experience also this sentiment of nostalgia. Because, as I told you, Cape Verde, when he was discovered, he was desert and was peopled with people who came from the continents, who came from Europe, who came from Africa, who came from America. And in Cape Verde, they create a new society, a new people, a new language, a new, a lot of new things, new gastronomy, eating, drinking, speaking, dancing, lyrics, very different, but results from the apports they bring with them. What happened is, after some years of liberation struggle, Cape Verde became independent for 40 years ago. And in Cape Verde, after the independence, we feel like we can cry, slavery nevermore, colonialism nevermore, racism nevermore, and all these satisfaction of being free and living in a free nation makes us feel another kind of nostalgia. What kind of nostalgia? The nostalgia of our future, who could be in the continent, but as our ancestral came to the island, we became islanders. So it is very curious that sometimes we experience this sentiment of the nostalgia of the future that we didn't have because our ancestry came to the island. If you can imagine someone who lives in the island, when he walk, he go and normally he reach a beach, the sea. There's no very long way to go. No, you go some 20, 40, 50, 70 kilometers, you find a beach, you find a seaside. And in one moment of our life, we experience the nostalgia of living in the country that you can go and go without never find the beach. you know. I think this is a different kind of nostalgia that I would like to speak to you. But of course, we have this longing that we experience all our life in the islands, because the one who goes are longing for his native land, and the one who stays are longing for these who are in the land far away. So we experience these different kinds of longing. In Portuguese, we have this unique word the name is saudade, saudade. And perhaps some of you has listened our main singer, Cesária Évora, has this song, Saudade, Saudade, Saudade de minha terra Cabo Verde. Saudade is the most expressive word that we have in our land. Saudade e Morabeza.
Yes, thank you for that insight. Yeah. Again, the feeling that you can only walk a limited amount of time and before you reach the beach is also very, very, very familiar to us here. And yes, as well as this idea of always using the mainland as a reference point and sort of source of your dreams is certainly something that's very common to us.
It's just a footnote. It was wonderful. It was really wonderful. I love Cesária Évora. And when you talked about reaching the beach and about the land, I was always amazed. Probably people of my age will remember an Italian singer, Lucio Dalla. And Lucio Dalla has a song about Ulysses, Capitano ca negli occhi. He goes, the refrain goes, so we know that Ulysses spends 10 years sailing home.
Yes.
And the song has this refrain goes Itaca, 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 a mia casa io voglio andare, Itaca, 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 dal mare, dal mare. Hey, he spent 10 years sailing the sea. Why would he need the sea? He wants his ring of the sea around his island. So we can talk about the water too as well, not only about the land.
Simona, how are we for time? No, okay. All right. So maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Any questions? Okay.
What I'm going to say might not really be that pertinent, but I have a question for Mrs. Drofenik.
Yes.
I've read The Confectioner's Daughter, and it seemed to me that you were digging to find your roots, being of Maltese origin. And in other books of yours, there seems to be a sort of coming back towards your homeland or your ancestors' homeland. Would I be correct to say that this is so?
Yes. Sorry. Yes, I think so. I think so. All my characters, I think, have a longing to come here. And I think that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about nostalgia, haven't we? How nostalgic you are and the love of your place. I think as a migrant, you never stop loving your country. Your country calls you all the time. It's in your heart. You cannot live without seeing your country. You know, I've had people, I talk to a lot of women, and they, migrant women, and they say they have an ache in their heart. It's this great longing to come back, to hear the bells of Birkirkara, to walk down the little lanes, you know, to smell a fig tree in summer, the leaves of the fig. It brings such a moving experience to you. And I think that's what I feel when I write. You know, I want to come back to my roots, yes. In my heart, that's what it is in my writing. And that's what my characters do, I suppose. Yes.
And he had family there, grandchildren and everything, but once he reached his pensionable age, he actually decided to come back.
Yes.
Practically, he had this agreement with his wife that she would, if they lived long enough, that is, that both of them would come back to Hamrun, actually,
yes.
right? Because he loved the local bands, the parish, as you said, the processions, the churches, and so on. This idea of smell, however, I think you are going to touch on this as well. I had this feeling, smell.
Yes.
Can you smell it from such
from
a long
Australia,
distance? Can you?
You know what I can smell from Australia? The garlic. The garlic, because when I was a little girl, my neighbor used to use a lot of garlic. And sometimes she used to drop a piece of garlic on the floor. And the kids, she had a lot of children. And the children used to step on the garlic. And you know the smell of stepped garlic. And sometimes that smell brings me right here in her house. And I don't know if it's nostalgic, but I think it's memory, isn't it? It's the memory of. And this is what keeps pulling you back to your country. What makes me write? Yes.
What motivates you to keep on writing about what you've left behind?
Well, because the characters keep talking to me. You know, they don't leave me alone. They wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning and they say, come on, get up. There are lots of voices in my head and they keep at me. And I have to do it, otherwise I go insane.
Thank you. We have another question over there.
Thank you all for your comments. My question is about identity. As authors who have lived away from your own country. And I ask this question for my own personal reasons. I have lived in Canada for 41 years. And I ask myself, people ask me, what do you consider yourself to be? That's my question for you.
Okay. Identity.
Well, I've lived in Australia for 56 years. I still see myself as Maltese, but I have Australian eyes. But in my heart, I am Maltese. Even though I think in English, I write in English, I speak in English. In my heart, I am still a Maltese person. I can't say I'm Australian. I'm not Australian. I am Maltese. But I have Australian eyes. And my identity has changed. Identity is always in flux, isn't it? It's not a static thing. We're always changing. We're taking on different roles. We're growing. We're picking up. I've picked a lot from Australian people. I have a lot of characteristics from Australia. But in my heart, I am still a Maltese person.
First.
Yeah. Philip, identity?
For a long time, I only spoke Romanian. I've been there 20 years, so I'd go through a day and only speak Romanian. But now I have a daughter. She's 6 now. She's just started school, and I speak English with her. And when she answers me back, I hear my own accent, my own expressions, words I use. So we've created a subculture, just two people, and whenever we do anything a little eccentric or different from what other people do around us, I just say, it's okay, Katya, we're Irish, we can do it. You don't have to put on your hat, you know, things like that. So I think it's very different when you have a kid, and you start to think about your own parents, and you see things very differently. You feel connected in a very different way through your own family. So that's my recent experience. That's the way I feel Irish. It's only in connection with my own child.
Nikola?
It's a very tough question for me, because for over years I teach a course entitled Identity. And I think that there is a wonderful article by Brubaker and Cooper, Beyond Identity. I think the word is overused. And George Orwell wrote an essay on English language, and he said, let's allow words to suggest their meanings to us. Let's not impose meanings to the words. So I think for oftentimes what we really mean while thinking that we're addressing identity is our identification. It's not really our identity. Like, for instance, what does it mean to be Croatian? How would I show somebody who's coming from a different planet that I'm a Croatian? I would make a Croatian dish. I would put some Croatian wardrobe on me. But then there are two verbs here confused, to be and to have. So then what would mean to be Croatian? It would mean to have things Croatian way, which is very dangerous for Serbs, because then we are and they are not. So I think you opened Pandora's box, and I can talk until tomorrow about identity. I don't think it really, I moved a lot, I had lots of, people can do terrible things in the name of identity, and I'm afraid of that word. And if I were to put myself, I would rather attach myself to time, not to space. And if it would be possible to get a passport that would say something like this, I would love to be the citizen of the 21st century. Vera?
Something you'd say about identity?
Okay, because identity is a term who interpels all of us. Yeah. Some days ago I was presenting the book of a professor of the university in Cape Verde, whose name is Nation and Identity. And I said, according to what you said, I said that the term we spend rivers, I can't say it in English, rivers of tinta, ink, and forest of paper to try to explain and to define the term identity, and this term continues to flow us. I think that in our contemporary world, with all these two phenomena of diasporization and globalization, these two phenomena brings really a very melange to this question of identity, because we cannot, in this our time, we cannot say that we have a unique identity. I think that the process of globalization and diasporization that we live in our world brings collaterally, oh my God, this question of hybrids identity. Of course, we always belong to a group, more massive group. There's always a group where we have more liaison, lies. But really, to have this definition is something, I agree with what he said, very, very difficult. We can spend times, paper, ink to try to define, because the problem of identity is always when we are questioning. Amin Malouf says the problem of identity is when you, the question about identity. This is very difficult for me to say in English. If it was in Portuguese, I will say, but...
No, but thank you anyway.
Yes.
And I think if there are no more questions, we can call it a night. And I'd like to really thank all of you for your contributions, and I think they all deserve a round of applause.
Thank you.